Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me on today's lockdown webinar. My name is Riz Omar, and I'm the COO of Locate Global Limited. Today, I'm going to be talking to you how you can communicate with your staff and employees through an ongoing crisis, and hopefully give you some practical tips and advice how you can communicate effectively. Today's webinar will take approximately 30 minutes, so please feel free to ask me any questions that you may have, and I'll endeavour to answer as many as I can at the end of the session. Today I'm going to be talking about a number of things, including how, as an organisation, do we identify that we are in a crisis? Can we plan our communications or anticipate the communications that will be required going before a crisis? How do we establish the correct means of communication or the correct channels of communication through a crisis? Do we need to consider the way we communicate and when we communicate with our staff during a crisis? Should we adopt a certain approach? And just as important as the crisis itself is the post-crisis analysis and how we continue communicating with our team going forward after the dust has settled. So you probably agree we are all currently living through a crisis right now. The coronavirus outbreak has impacted nearly everyone in the world, and it's staggering to think in a space of a few days in March, the coronavirus outbreak has now become this all-consuming global crisis. And the impacts have been unprecedented. It's impacted our social behaviour, it's impacted our free movement, it's impacted our lawmaking by governments. It's impacted the way we meet each other, and it's impacted business functions and business operation, as well as the pandemic fueling uncertainty and turmoil across the globe. As the impacts of the outbreak continue to change our lives, people across the globes are adopting new ways of working to help authorities stem the spread of the virus. But new ways of working create, obviously, new challenges, as well as new opportunities and collaborations. Organizations will find that not having some sort of communication strategy in place through this crisis will impact their employees' productivity and also reduce their engagement. Lack of direct communication with your staff will make them feel isolated, disengaged, and out of the loop from the decision makers. Effective communication is critical as companies adjust to navigate through this global issue. For businesses, the requirements to safeguard their employees and finding new ways to work, as well as balancing this against the operational needs and operational changes, and fighting for their survival of their company, is a challenge for many. As the coronavirus was emerging, it was interesting to see how the global tech giants like Twitter, Google, and Microsoft moved quite quickly to introduce remote working and home working across their staff. And it was only replicated by other organizations once lockdowns had been introduced and restrictions had been put in place. And it forced organizations to make decisions very quickly and change the way they operate. One thing that will affect nearly everybody on the globe is the impact of the downturn of the global economy. The Asian Development Bank reported that the coronavirus could cost the global economy anything between $5.8 trillion and $8.8 trillion. And this is mainly due to organizations and governments putting in measures in place to slow down the spread of COVID-19, which in turn, in parallel, has paralyzed the economic activity around the world. Very early on, we saw global authorities taking very aggressive action to safeguard their people and the economies. We saw swift closures of borders. We saw centralized banks slashing interest rates. We saw widespread restrictions on travel globally. But now, a few weeks later, or a couple of months later, we are now beginning to see the wider implications on the economy. We are hearing of large organizations warning on widespread redundancies and closures of global sites. So what does this imply? Well, it tells me that business as usual, or business as we know it, will not return for a very long time. And this pandemic means things will remain changeable, and we may have ongoing crises in the future. So this is a time for all organizations to assess their crisis communications plans and make sure they're well set up for an ongoing crisis. So how do you know as an organization that you are in a crisis? Well, for me, a business crisis occurs when something unexpected happens, which will threaten or risk the stability of your organization or its business functions, or the people and personnel that work for it. There's usually some sort of imminent threat. Tomorrow, the borders are closing, so your travelers will not be able to leave a certain country. There's some sort of surprise or shock element. It's something you haven't predicted or thought about. There's also a pressure to respond, not just a pressure to respond operationally, but maybe a pressure to respond via communications or the messaging that you're sending out to your stakeholders, board members, and staff. So why does internal communication matter in a crisis? In its simplest form, internal communications during a crisis enables your employees to do their jobs in the most effective way, which in turn helps you to continue deliver in some sort of capacity to your clients and customers and stakeholders. But also internal communications help explain to your employees what's expected of them and how it will help you fulfill your ambitions and goals as a business. So what are the things you need to consider when you're putting a crisis communication plan together or a crisis plan together? Well, first of all, you need to understand what it is you're trying to protect. Is it your operations? Is it your reputation? Is it your supply chain? Or is it your personnel and staff? Also, you need to understand what are your current limitations within your operations and staff. What are the gaps? Where are the risks to those operations? When you're putting a crisis management team together, you need to get the right team in place. Organizations traditionally are very hierarchical and feel that the senior board members are the ones that should make all the decisions when it comes to crisis management. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be involved, but I'm saying you should always have the people in your crisis management team who are able to get the job done. The people who know the hacks in your supply chain, the people who know who to contact when you need something. The other thing you should do when you're putting your plan together is anticipate what are the things that could go wrong and try and understand where your gaps lie. Dealing with a crisis is like going to war. You need the right approach, it needs to be effective, and you have to ensure things don't get worse for your organization. You need to prepare your war room before you start dealing with a crisis. And part of dealing with a crisis is having a crisis communication strategy. During a crisis, a lack of direct communication with your employees will make them feel isolated, disengaged, and out of the loop. Even though the pandemic continues and organizations and employees are grappling with the unknown, the pandemic may be unique, but how we navigate through this crisis is not necessarily unique. Similar to the global financial downturn or 9/11, just like then, employees are now worried. Well, staff and organizations don't know what the future holds. People are asking if their jobs are safe. How will I manage working differently? And effective communication is critical as companies try to adjust and navigate through this global issue. A common questions organization may be asking is, how quickly can we notify our workforce of an operational change or any change? How do we inform multiple individuals and stakeholders about this change? How do we know if crucial messages have been received or actioned? How can we reduce the numbers of rumors or misinformation so it may cause further disruption? So with this in mind, there are some things you need to consider when you're putting your communication plan together. It's always going to be harder to do this once a crisis is ongoing and started. You should always consider drafting material in advance, especially for predictable outcomes. It will help you be able to communicate faster and efficiently and not wasting time trying to write the right thing or get the right message out. Secondly, you should always have the right people in place, the right people to do the job, the right people to get things done. Minimize the red tape in decision making. If every decision has to be signed off by senior management and has to be escalated up, this won't be an efficient way of communicating when it counts. Also, as an organization, know the process that you have in place and know the channels of communications which are available to you. Understanding the limitations of those channels and the gaps will help you effectively plan for a crisis as it emerges. Multi-channel communications are essential during a crisis. Not one form of communication or one means of communication is an effective way to communicate with your entire workforce. During a crisis, operations can be decentralized, and they should be if required, but your communications should always be sent out from one central place. One of the first things you should do when you're establishing which means you would like to communicate with your employees or staff or stakeholders is to map out your audience, who that is. And then you need to map out your communication channels, and then you need to audit the effectiveness of each of those channels. You need to understand who you want to reach and how. Plus, you want to ask questions like, how clean is your data that you hold? Where is this information being pulled from? Who has access to this data? Where is this data being kept? Now, this might be easy for small teams to manage what's happening, but what happens when it's 200 people or 10,000 people or 100,000 people in your organization? You need to know the limitations of each means you use. There's no point sending out numerous emails to someone who doesn't have good connectivity because they live in a rural location or they're working in a rural location. When you're establishing new channels, you want to consider the risks of using those new channels. Do we need to implement new ways of working? Do we need to implement new security measures or mitigation? What are the vulnerabilities of using this new way of communicating? Do we need to train people on how to use this? Do we need to spend some money on training? What about critical messages over routine messages? Do we have a means of checking responses and monitoring those responses? How do we communicate operational changes or safety updates? And especially when we need these to be understood or acknowledged. How do you log these as an organization? Lots of organizations will turn to email as their go-to channel for mass communication. And although this is widely adopted and a universal platform, it does have its limitations. Emails are often delivered to junk or other folders where recipients may miss them. Information can be lost amongst other incoming messages. With emails, the onus is always on the recipient to assess the relevance of the email. Emailing multiple people becomes cumbersome and slow. The recipients can choose to ignore the communications regardless of the importance. And you as an organization may not know if your messages are being read and understood. And monitoring multiple replies can be difficult. So what are the benefits of multi-channel communication or a mass communication tool? Well, it allows you to send information from a central location. Mass notification platforms allow your employees to respond to specific questions or report issues directly to one place. This enables companies to make decisions based on actual responses and real-time data. You're able to deliver the same communication in multiple ways across different channels. Also, it allows you to provide clear and consistent messaging from one place. It allows, some systems allow you to share up-to-date advice or change procedures or essential operational updates. And also you can deliver messages to 1 or 10,000 recipients instantly You can use geographical locations with some systems, which allow you to send messages to specific groups or individuals. And you can schedule these communications and share media, documentation, and policies. These platforms also can be used to invite users to official company collaboration channels and new ways of working, such as Slack or Trello, or your company's intranet or information portal. So how do we communicate with our staff during an ongoing crisis? Well, during a crisis, your communications are an opportunity for your organization to show your staff that you have control, that you are handling this crisis in the best possible way. If you can, always trying to use your leaders within your communications. It doesn't just have to be the CEO, but it should be the people who are best informed. This provides reassurance to your staff. This is also an opportunity, your crisis communication is also an opportunity to thank your staff for the changes that you have imposed, and an opportunity for you as an organization to offer support. Also, it allows senior leadership to check in with team members outside of official communications if required. You as an organization should be the first people that tell your employers of any changes or operational changes or company changes. Don't let them hear the changes from third parties or outside sources. You need to be the main source of information about your company. When you're communicating through a crisis, you need to be human with your communications. You need to consider your workforce and you need to consider the challenges that they're facing. Are they now homeschooling? Are they caring for someone? Do they have limited connectivity because they live in a semi-rural area? As well as being empathetic in your communications, you need to provide updates to your employees on a regular basis. It's always better to have an update that says there is no changes than no communications at all. On the other hand, when you do have information, keep it brief and simple. Long technical messages by health professionals or your legal department will not be easily understood. Another thing to consider is make your communications relevant. Don't address people who are not impacted or don't need certain types of information. There is no point contacting your whole organization regarding a change in operations when it only impacts a very small number of people. People have a limited window to absorb information in a crisis, and making it as simple for them as possible will help you in the long run. Tell your staff which channels you will use for what types of communication. For example, you may want to say, we will use emails for all routine updates, and any critical updates or changes will be communicated via SMS. You should also remind your employees and staff of the policies that you have in place, because during a crisis and under change, people may forget the correct procedures. And they may negate doing certain aspects of their role because now they're working differently. And the final thing is always provide an opportunity for your staff to provide feedback or responses. And this needs to be centralized as well, allowing you to assess their needs and requirements quickly. Do you need to consider a different approach when you're communicating through a crisis? Don't underestimate the power of your communications during a crisis, for the better or worse. Don't underestimate repeating your message for a message that needs to be understood. This crisis, the COVID-19, threatens health and safety and is likely to linger for some time. So your new messages should be layered in between regular safety reminders, especially if safety advice is changing and ongoing. Always focus on the facts. Don't sugarcoat the facts. Be transparent. Tell them what it is that you know and what is unknown. Tell your staff where you are getting this information. Remember, your teams will be probably helping you through the process, so they will know if you're holding back or not telling the truth. People expect credible and relevant information. And when employees believe that they are being misled or that the risks are downplayed, they will lose confidence. Involve your team where possible in decision making. An organization that listens and where employees can have their voice heard are more productive. An effective internal communication plan recognizes the importance of two-way communication. Employees feel empowered and part of the solution and feel like they're striving for a common goal. This approach helps employees feel valued and that they are playing a part in delivering the organization's vision and goals. Act on data and real-time intelligence rather than just broadcasting messaging and dictating change with no real reason or feedback to work on. Also, organizations should use this opportunity to help individuals cope emotionally with the trauma of sudden change and the adjustments of new ways of working. You may find that your team members who are used to working in large groups are now feeling isolated because they're working remotely and on their own. And finally, post-crisis. What's the new normal? This phase is just as important to get your communication right going forward as it was during the crisis itself. Once the crisis is over, there will be a lot to reflect on how you dealt with the crisis and what the outcomes of that crisis were. It's also important going forward that you communicate those reflections and changes or outcomes with your team. Where possible, provide your staff with clear outline when further information will be available and how often that information will be available. Provide facilities for your employees to share their feedback on the effectiveness of your communication during the crisis. Their input may help you avoid similar problems in other crises or other situations going forward. Equally, it's important for you as an organization to evaluate your communication channels, how they performed. Could you have done things differently? Do you now need to find a platform that allows you to send mass notifications from one central place? Is your current platform providing everything that you need? And all this feedback and this evaluation should feed into your next communication plan, your next crisis communication plan, allowing you to make better decisions when the next crisis comes along. Thank you, everybody. That's the end of my webinar. I hope you found this useful. I'm now available to answer any of your questions that you may have.